What appears at first glance to be a dispute over a bridge between two neighboring nations is in truth something far more serious. It is a constitutional question about the integrity of executive power, the proper boundaries between public authority and private interest, and the enduring obligation of government officials to act for the nation rather than for favored individuals. When a president threatens to obstruct the opening of a publicly funded international crossing, and that threat follows closely upon a reported meeting between a senior cabinet official and the owner of a competing private enterprise, we are no longer in the realm of ordinary politics. We are in the realm of constitutional structure and public trust. The publicly reported sequence is straightforward. The owner of a privately held bridge connecting the United States and Canada reportedly met with the Secretary of Commerce. That bridge has long enjoyed a dominant position in cross-border commercial traffic. The competing bridge, publicly financed and the product of binding bilateral agreements, is designed to introduce competition, increase capacity, and enhance safety at one of the busiest land border crossings in North America. Hours after that reported meeting, the president publicly declared that he would block the opening of the new bridge. Members of Congress have since requested communications and records to determine whether private financial interests influenced that presidential posture. It is essential to be precise. Allegations are not findings. Investigations are not verdicts. But the Constitution does not wait for scandal before it speaks. It establishes structural safeguards precisely because the temptation to blend public power with private advantage is as old as Republican government itself. The Constitution vests the executive power in the president, but it does so within a framework of fiduciary obligation. The president does not own the executive branch. He holds it in trust for the people of the United States. That trust carries with it a duty of impartiality and a duty of fidelity to the national interest. When executive decisions bear directly on commercial actors who stand to gain or lose immense financial benefit, the constitutional concern is not whether the president is forceful or strategic. The concern is whether the power of the United States is being exercised for public purposes rather than private protection. Congress, for its part, holds the authority of oversight. That authority is not ornamental. It is embedded in the separation of powers. When members of the House of Representatives request emails, texts, and calendar records relating to a meeting that may have preceded a consequential executive action, they are performing a constitutional function. They are not intruding into executive discretion. They are ensuring that discretion has not been converted into favoritism. Our constitutional history is replete with warnings about the dangers of concentrated economic and political power intertwining. From the early debates over public credit and federal contracts, to later concerns about monopolies and regulatory capture, the lesson has remained constant. A republic cannot endure if its institutions are perceived to serve the powerful few at the expense of the broader public. The framers did not assume virtue. They constructed mechanisms to restrain ambition with ambition, to ensure that no branch could quietly redirect national policy for private ends without scrutiny. In this controversy, the stakes are not limited to a single infrastructure project. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is the product of negotiated commitments between two sovereign nations. International agreements, once made and funded, carry both legal and diplomatic weight. If executive threats to disrupt such projects are perceived as responsive to private lobbying rather than to legitimate policy concerns, the consequences reverberate beyond domestic commerce. They implicate the credibility of the United States in honoring its commitments. This is why the present moment demands seriousness rather than spectacle. The question is not whether one political figure outmaneuvered another. The question is whether the architecture of constitutional governance is being respected. When executive power is deployed in ways that align with the financial interests of a politically connected individual, and when that alignment follows private access to senior officials, the burden falls on our institutions to demonstrate transparency and accountability. You should understand that this is how constitutional stress often manifests. It does not arrive with sirens. It arrives as a sequence of decisions, meetings, and public statements that, taken together, test whether our safeguards are real or merely aspirational. The durability of the republic depends not on the absence of controversy, but on the faithful operation of oversight, disclosure, and lawful restraint when controversy arises. The executive branch possesses substantial authority over trade, foreign commerce, and the administration of international agreements. That authority is neither accidental nor trivial. It reflects the practical reality that the nation must speak with coherence in its dealings abroad. Yet coherence is not license. Discretion is not exemption. The President's power over foreign commerce operates within statutory frameworks enacted by Congress and within treaty obligations undertaken by the United States. It is bounded by law, by appropriations, and by the constitutional expectation that official action will be directed toward legitimate public ends. When a publicly funded international bridge has been constructed pursuant to binding cross-border agreements, and when substantial federal and state resources have been committed to its completion, any effort to obstruct its opening must rest on lawful authority. That authority must be identifiable. It must be articulated. and it must be grounded in national policy considerations that withstand scrutiny. If instead the impetus for obstruction is even arguably linked to the financial preservation of a private monopoly, the constitutional inquiry becomes unavoidable. The separation of powers was designed precisely for moments such as this. Congress controls the purse. It regulates commerce with foreign nations. It has authority to conduct investigations in aid of legislation and oversight. The executive implements the laws and conducts foreign relations within those statutory confines. When the lines blur, when executive action appears to track private interest rather than articulated national strategy, the legislative branch is not merely permitted to inquire, it is obligated to do so. You will recall that throughout our history, episodes of perceived favoritism have tested public confidence in government. The concern is rarely confined to the immediate transaction. Rather, it is the precedent that troubles us. If one politically connected enterprise can secure protective intervention through access, what assurance remains for competitors, for states, or for international partners who rely upon neutral administration of the law? Markets function on predictability. Diplomacy functions on credibility. Both are undermined when policy appears transactional. It is also important to distinguish between lawful advocacy and improper influence. Private actors are entitled to petition their government. They may present arguments, data, and policy concerns. That is a constitutional right. What transforms ordinary advocacy into a constitutional concern is not the meeting itself, but the possibility that official power is wielded to insulate a private actor from lawful competition, particularly when that competition has been authorized and funded through public processes. The reported circumstances surrounding this bridge controversy implicate precisely that distinction. The privately owned crossing has long operated at a commercially advantageous position. The introduction of a new, publicly backed bridge would alter that landscape. That is the nature of competition. It may diminish revenue. It may shift traffic patterns. But economic consequence alone does not justify executive obstruction of a lawful public project. If it did, the federal government would become an arbiter of private profit rather than a steward of the national interest. This is why the requests from members of Congress for communications and records are constitutionally significant. They are not predicated on accusation. They are predicated on verification. The American people are entitled to know whether executive deliberations were informed by legitimate trade and security considerations or by the narrower concern of preserving a particular enterprise's revenue stream. Transparency in this context is not punitive. It is protective of institutional legitimacy. We must also consider the federalism dimension. International border infrastructure often involves coordination among federal, state, and provincial authorities. When the federal executive threatens unilateral interference with a project that has garnered state support and international agreement, the balance between national authority and local partnership is strained. The Constitution envisions cooperation, not coercion, untethered from law. The danger, therefore, lies not solely in the outcome of this particular dispute. It lies in the normalization of executive intervention on behalf of concentrated private power. Once such intervention is perceived as routine, the structural safeguards of the Constitution begin to erode in subtle but consequential ways. Citizens may conclude that influence eclipses law, that access outweighs process. And when that perception hardens, confidence in democratic governance declines. Our system depends on more than formal legality. It depends on the disciplined exercise of power within understood norms. If those norms are tested, the remedy is not rhetorical escalation. It is careful oversight, faithful adherence to statutory limits, and a recommitment by each branch to its constitutional role. In moments such as this, it is tempting to reduce the controversy to personalities, to frame it as a contest between strong leaders, or as a tactical maneuver in the theater of international politics. That temptation must be resisted. The Constitution is not concerned with the temperament of office holders. It is concerned with the allocation and restraint of power. When the executive branch signals a willingness to disrupt a major infrastructure project undertaken pursuant to international commitments, the constitutional inquiry centers on authority, justification, and institutional integrity. The historical record instructs us that the gravest risks to Republican government do not typically arise from overt defiance of law. They arise from the gradual blending of public office with private advantage. The framers were acutely aware of this danger. Their experience with imperial patronage and monopolistic privilege informed a deep suspicion of arrangements in which economic power could secure governmental favoritism. The Constitution's architecture, including its emoluments provisions and its separation of legislative and executive powers, reflects that suspicion. It is therefore not incidental that this controversy involves a monopoly over a vital commercial crossing. Monopolies, by their nature, concentrate economic leverage. When that leverage intersects with political access, the appearance of impropriety can be as corrosive as impropriety itself. Public confidence depends not only on the absence of corruption, but on the visible commitment of institutions to avoid even the perception that policy is for sale or protection is purchasable. You should also appreciate the international dimension. Cross-border trade between the United States and Canada represents billions of dollars in economic activity annually. Infrastructure at that border is not a trivial matter of local convenience. It is a linchpin of continental commerce. When the United States enters binding agreements to facilitate such infrastructure, it signals reliability. If executive threats to block those projects appear to follow private lobbying, our trading partners are entitled to question whether American commitments are stable or contingent. This is not an abstract concern. The rule of law in foreign relations depends on predictability. Businesses invest capital, states allocate resources, and governments negotiate agreements based on the assumption that the United States will honor its undertakings absent compelling public justification to the contrary. If policy reversals track private financial exposure rather than articulated national interests, that predictability is weakened. The legislative branch's response is therefore critical. Oversight is not merely about exposure of wrongdoing. It is about reaffirmation of constitutional boundaries. By requesting communications, by examining timelines, and by evaluating the legal basis for any executive threat, Congress performs its duty to ensure that the executive remains accountable to law rather than insulated by discretion. This process is deliberate by design. It is meant to cool passions and to replace suspicion with documented fact. We must be equally careful not to prejudge outcomes. An investigation may reveal that the executive's concerns were grounded in policy considerations wholly unrelated to private meetings. It may demonstrate that the sequence of events was coincidental rather than causal. Constitutional governance requires patience as well as vigilance. Yet vigilance is indispensable. Without inquiry, there can be no assurance. There is another dimension that merits your attention. Infrastructure decisions, especially those involving public funds and international coordination, are typically the product of years of negotiation, environmental review, legislative authorization, and appropriations. To disrupt such a project at the 11th hour is not a minor administrative adjustment. It is a significant assertion of executive influence over a complex web of statutory and diplomatic commitments. That assertion must be legally sustainable. It must rest on more than preference.